Hello and welcome to this video about the design of effective assessments in higher education. This is going to be a pragmatic introductory guide. My name is Professor Phil Newton, and what we're going to do in this video is consider some of the theoretical and the practical features of effective assessment design. It's aimed at individual educators and the sorts of things that you have under your control when you're designing your assessments. We're going to try and be practical and useful. We're going to focus on higher education, and to do that we're going to introduce the fictitious generic University of Lobster as the setting for the content of this video. Why are assessments carried out at the University of Lobster? What role do assessments play in defining the fundamental purpose of the University of Lobster, etc. And yes, for the avoidance of all doubt, the University of Lobster does not exist, and all the pictures that you see from the fictional University of Lobster have been created using ChatGPT. Okay, so let's start with the most fundamental and basic question. What is assessment for? Why do we do it? A simple answer to this is that an assessment gives us information about learning. We can't currently see into here and figure out what somebody has learned through analysing the function and content of their brain, at least not in a way that's practically useful for those of us working in higher education. So instead we use an assessment to give us some form of information about what it is that someone has learned. When we're trying to decide what type of assessment to do and how to do it, we need to ask ourselves why we want the information. The type of assessment that we pick depends largely on the type of information that we want, and in particular, the use that we are going to make of that information. For example, let's consider 4 basic uses for assessment information. All of these uses overlap, but they are also distinct in their own ways. There are many other types of ways in which we might want to use assessment information, but for now we'll just consider these 4. The first one then is one that has been, for better or worse, familiar to educators and students for hundreds of years. Let's say we want to determine the basic core knowledge that a student has. For example, early on in a degree program, we specifically want to know what it is that the student knows. How much do they know? What are some things that the class overall is struggling with? We want to determine that knowledge in the absence of the internet or AI or other external sources. And in this sort of case, many educational institutions commonly use a traditional in-person exam, and the student is typically given a grade like an A or B or a C or a percentage mark. The second use type we might have for assessment information is to make a determination about whether or not someone is safe or competent at a particular task. This is a common use for assessment information in professional qualifications like health and law and engineering. The focus of the information for this type of assessment use tends to be on the definition or the threshold of competence or safety. These sorts of assessments tend to focus less on whether or not someone is very good at a task or is struggling a lot at a task. They're mostly focused on that threshold of competence or safety, and making sure that the examiners and then the public at large can be confident which side of the threshold the learners are. Are they safe or not? Are they competent or not? Thus, the information we get might be focused on a pass or a fail rather than an A, B, C, D grade. The third type of information might be for us to determine how effective a learner is at a practical hands-on task. Many of the features here can be the same as traditional exams, but are focused more on practical action, and there may be discipline-specific features about the type of information learners have access to when they're completing this assessment, for example. The fourth type of information, really important and which we should not consider, is primarily information to help future learning, for our students to help them learn as they go along, and for us as educators to get some more informal and flexible feedback about how they are getting on so that we know where and when to focus our future efforts. This is really important because the process of taking and creating practice assessments is one of the most effective ways to learn content through a cognitive process called retrieval practice. I've covered this in another video, focused specifically on retrieval practice, but I'm looping it in here because the principles of effective assessment still apply if we're designing effective assessments for retrieval practice. There are many other uses for assessment information. Perhaps the one we most commonly think of is information that leads to the award of a qualification, like a degree. This is one of the defining features of a university, as we might consider in other videos. Assessment information is also used for some uses that are perhaps not directly linked to giving information about learning. For example, it is commonly used to evaluate the performance of universities in the form of league tables. In the United Kingdom, where I'm based, this specifically involves a direct link between the numbers of students who get high grades and improved league table performance. Higher marks means higher up the league tables. The league tables then influence the recruitment of students to universities, and so under the current financial model of higher education in the UK and some other countries, this directly contributes to the financial health and viability of UK universities. i.e., for a university to be financially healthy, students need to get good marks. Now, whether these sorts of uses of assessment information are valid or fair or justified is a conversation for another video, but I'm putting it in here because we have to acknowledge that this happens, because it provides incentives to the design of assessment, and those incentives might also not always align with effective assessment design. This then leads us on to perhaps the most important feature of assessment design, and that is validity. Every textbook will tell you that an effective assessment has to demonstrate validity, but unfortunately validity is quite a difficult concept to pin down. We used to think of validity as basically, does an assessment measure the thing that it's supposed to measure? For example, if we want information about whether a student can perform a practical task, then a multiple choice test might not be a valid way to do it. That, though, leads us on to a more modern interpretation of validity, which is slightly more nebulous, but is perhaps more accurate. And that is whether the information provided by an assessment is appropriate to support the use to which that information is made. Try and explain that in practical terms. If we want to use the information from an assessment to decide whether or not a student is competent to perform a practical task, we design a practical assessment around a defined competency threshold. If we want to design an assessment to give us information to allow us to determine how good a student is at that task, to give them a grade, then we design the assessment with a detailed rubric, a grade scheme that allows us to identify meaningful different levels of performance. When we think about validity this way, how we're going to use the information and whether the assessment gives us the appropriate information for that use, then the assessment itself is not what is valid. It is instead the validity residing in our use of the information that the assessment provides. Validity then, old-fashioned definition of it, an assessment is designed to measure what it is intended to measure. More up-to-date version of validity, does the information provided by an assessment support the decisions that are made from the results of that assessment? Okay, let's get in then to the detail of what makes an effective assessment, the design principles, in addition to this overarching concept of validity. A simple way to think about this, or a start for thinking about this from a practical perspective, is that a good assessment is a measure of what someone can do. Those two letters, D-O, do, are probably the most important thing to take away from this section and maybe from the video overall. If you are designing an assessment and you are focused on what the learner is going to do, then you will be off to a great start. Often in higher education, we use a proxy for this. So to give you just one example, we might get students to write timed essay exams to assess their learning of science. Thus, the information that the assessment gives us is evidence of writing about science, but maybe what we really wanted was information about their ability to do some science. So start by thinking about what is it that the student is going to do, and does that align with the information that we want from the assessment? Some common and familiar things that students are asked to do: they're asked to answer MCQs, often in the form of exams, to write free text in essays and dissertations, and again in exams. They might be asked to talk, to give a presentation, to prepare and present a poster. They might do a practical skill in the form of a clinical exam like an OSCE or a data analysis task. They might do bigger projects like a capstone project or write a research report. They might do an oral viva, like in a thesis defense, or is commonly used for summative assessment in many European countries. They might be assessed in the workplace. might be assessed by their mentor or by an examiner examining their performance on a particular workplace task. And then lots of individual assessments are often compiled together in the form of a portfolio. These are just some of the common types of assessments that we use in higher education. So, a big part of what an effective assessment is what the student does. A second major part of this, as we've already discussed, is why we are asking them to do it, which relates to validity. Then, the detail and the design comes from how we ask them to do it. Some of that comes from assessment theory, some of it comes from assessment practice. There are a lot of things to consider here, and we're just going to do the basics. So, from assessment theory, we have validity, as we've already talked about, reliability, authenticity, security, etc. And then we have the practical aspects, invigilated, closed book, in-person, etc. Now, before we get into the detail of all these, let's just pause a second. That previous slide had a lot of text on it. The font was quite small. You might be thinking, this is going to be a long video. Am I really going to watch it all? Why couldn't he just put it into some smaller videos, into bite-sized chunks? And I get it. And so does the YouTube algorithm. Short, bite-sized videos are the way to YouTube fame. But that's not the most useful way to do this. We could explain these things in shorter chunks, but all of the things on the previous slide, and as are going to be covered in the rest of the video, they interact. So if you spend a lot of time focusing on, say, reliability, you have effects on security and student experience and authenticity and so on. Some of this can be unexpected and difficult to predict. So there isn't really a single way to get an assessment perfect, and there isn't really a way to tease these things out. It's better for us to spend a bit of time, stay with me, and cover all of these things together. This is also where the pragmatism part comes in. No assessment is perfect. An assessment gives us information about what our students have learned. We decide what we want the information for the purpose of the assessment, then we try and design the best assessment we can within the resources we have, using these intertwined theoretical and practical concepts. We give it a go. What we're going to do then for the rest of this video, pragmatically, is give you a whistle-stop tour of some of these practical and theoretical features and how they interact. Use that to define each of the theoretical concepts, and then at the end we'll give some examples to tie these things together, hopefully in a way that's useful. Okay, so back to the features. We'll go through the theoretical points on the right one by one. We'll come back to them in a moment. Practical points on the left are largely self-explanatory, and we will revisit them in the examples, but let's just cover a few of the terms now, because some of them vary depending upon where you are in the world. Invigilated means the assessment is supervised, but not necessarily by the examiner. In the United States and other countries, this might be more commonly referred to as being proctored. An invigilator is a proctor, or someone who is essentially overseeing the exam but is not doing the examining. They're there largely for purposes of security and also to answer questions and to deal with some practical issues. Closed book means the learner does not have access to additional resources like notes or the internet. Open book generally means that they do. This is not really a binary closed book versus open book, because in lots of situations you might give learners access to some limited amount of additional resources, but not just let them look at whatever it is they want. In person means the assessor and the student, the examiner and the student are in the same physical place. Real time means the assessor observes the student undertaking the assessment task. This can be online, but it can still be real time. Asynchronous means an assessment is done in the learner's own time. Unseen means the learner does not know the details of the assessment task beforehand, whereas seen means they're given the exam questions or the assessment tasks. Now, we are going to go back over these with some examples that will hopefully make them clear, but I thought it's worth just introducing those here. All right, let's move on then to each of the items of the theory, and we're going to start with reliability. We're probably going to spend most of our time, or the most time, on this one individual item. Reliability of assessment design just basically means consistency. How likely is it that the same student taking the same assessment twice would get the same mark? There are lots of things that affect reliability, that cause variance in the 2 marks that a hypothetical student might get if they took the same assessment twice. The student themselves is, thankfully still, a human being. Students might have different levels of performance depending upon various physical and other factors that are outside of our control as examiners. Are they hungry? Are they tired? Are they stressed? Are they distracted? Is life getting in the way? There's not really anything we can do about that other than maybe provide them with support where possible, but it does cause some sources of variance. Intra-marker reliability. If I am marking a particular assessment on a particular day, then I am going to be subject to some of those same variances as the students. I might have had a good night's sleep, a bad night's sleep, etc. There's also variation during the day. I'm going to get cognitively fatigued if I'm marking a lot of assessments. I might also have a bias or a halo effect for certain students if they're not being marked anonymously. Then there is inter-marker reliability. If an assessment is marked by multiple examiners, are they all marking the same way, using the same criteria and the same level of fairness? And they are themselves then obviously also subject to the intra-marker reliability. Then there's subjectivity. Some topics, some assessments, some content is more subjective than others. Multiple choice questions are objective normally. There is a right and wrong answer. Lots of other types of assessment are subjective. If you're getting someone to do a critical appraisal, you're getting them to write a research project, then right and wrong is not quite so obvious and it might be more subjective. This is not to say that subjectivity is a bad thing, and in many forms of higher level assessment, subjectivity is inherent. We just have to acknowledge that subjectivity will often make an assessment slightly less mathematically, numerically reliable. If the assessment items are poorly worded, the exam questions are poorly worded and ambiguous, or the mark schemes, the rubrics are poorly worded, then that can introduce unreliability into the assessment process. A different type of unreliability comes from insufficient sampling. If you have a course that lasts for 10 weeks and you only assess content that comes from the last week, then you're going to introduce a level of unreliability because you're only assessing a small amount of the content. If you are assessing items from across all of the 10 weeks, but there's only one shorted question for each of the weeks, then you're all going to have insufficient items. You're not really assessing the content fully. If you don't have enough data to determine whether an assessment is reliable, then you're going to make it unreliable. Then the testing conditions themselves can influence whether or not an assessment is reliable. If you have a large assessment and you have students in multiple venues when they're taking it, the venues are going to be different. Some might be too hot, some might be too cold, some might be noisy, some might not, etc. We can deal with some of these with some additional features that are not covered in the main list of practical and theoretical considerations. For example, marker training can help us with some of the intra and inter-marker reliability, some of the issues of subjectivity, and possibly with some of the poorly worded items. We just need to explain to some of our examiners, to our assessors, to our academics, what do we need to do? What are some issues to look for? Just go through the details of an assessment with them before they do it. We can also review the assessment content both before and after it's been used. Let's say we have an exam paper or we have a set of essay questions. We can get a small group of us together just to go over the items. Are they appropriately worded? Are there any typos? Do they make logical sense? Do they cover the curriculum? Just having a little sit down and look over the assessment items can really help with avoiding larger issues later on. Similarly then, after the assessments happened, did the assessment work out the way that we expected it to? Were there some exam questions where students really struggled, or some that were too easy, or some where the marks don't seem to make sense? And we can see then that perhaps even after the event, maybe they were poorly worded. We can also go through a process that's known as blueprinting. This is something we really want to do before an assessment is done and as part of a design of an overall program of assessment. Blueprinting simply just maps the assessments to the learning outcomes and the content of the teaching to make sure that all of the content is appropriately covered, are all the learning outcomes appropriately assessed. It's important to be clear that reliability is more than just a statistical or a procedural nicety. If an assessment is unreliable, then it's difficult to achieve validity. Whatever you're using the information for, whether it is to make decisions about degree awards or learner safety and competence, whatever it is, then those decisions are undermined if the assessment data are unreliable, if they're noisy. There are also more basic questions of fairness. For example, If a student gets a lower grade because they were marked by someone who wasn't trained, but their peers got a higher mark on the same assessment because they were graded by someone who was trained, that's not fair. Or if an assessment only covers a small part of the curriculum, and some students have only studied that part, they get an equivalent grade to a student who studied all the content. That again seems unfair. Okay, let's be clear then about some things that are in our control that we can look at when we're trying to make sure that an assessment is reliable. There are lots of things to consider with reliability, as we've just discussed, but there are some additional features that we just need to cover off. An assessment that is reliable tends to be an assessment where there is an invigilator, where the learner is overseen when they do the assessment. It tends to be closed book, in person, real time, and most importantly, from a reliability perspective, it tends to be objective. If there are right and wrong answers, then you have a much better estimation of the reliability of the assessment compared to some more subjective assessments that we'll talk about in a moment. Okay, let's move on to authenticity. This tends to be authentic for the workplace, and so the practical design features of an authentic assessment are largely dependent upon what that workplace is and then what task the learner is performing. For example, performing an urgent clinical skill in an emergency room would likely have to be done quickly, in real time, in high stakes. It might be objective in that there is a right and wrong way to do it, and the learner might have little information about what is coming up. In contrast, maybe a different type of authentic assessment might have different features. Maybe writing legal documents might be asynchronous, subjective, done online, with feedback coming months after the task. I'm not really going to say much more about authenticity because it's very much dependent upon the workplace that the learners might go into or the context in which they might want to use that information in an authentic way. Okay, let's move on to assessment security. By this, we mean, how does the design of an assessment influence whether students are likely to commit misconduct? This is often referred to simply as cheating, but the reality is a bit more complicated than that. Perhaps a broader way of thinking about security is whether an assessment design makes it more or less likely that some students will gain an unfair advantage. Or to put it another way, is the work being assessed going to reflect the learning of the student, or is it instead going to represent something else, like the output of AI or the content of Wikipedia? It's important to be clear that no assessment design is completely immune to misconduct or to cheating or to these security issues. But there are certainly assessment designs which make it much easier for people to cheat, and everything we know about human behavior tells us that people are more likely to bend the rules if it's easier for them to do. There are data from some types of assessments, like unsupervised online remote exams, where more students cheat than don't. This then punishes students who do follow the rules. There are some things we can say generally improve the security of an assessment, and the thing that they have in common is there tends to be some level of direct observation of the learner, whether that's by an invigilator or proctor or the examiner themselves. So the assessment is then done in real time, and then the assessment materials themselves need to be subject to some level of security. That tends to improve the security overall of the assessment and make it more resilient to misconduct. Okay, let's move on to assessment experience. This refers to the experience of the students and, to an extent, of the staff. Is everyone involved having a good time? Or are they not having a bad time, is maybe a more appropriate way to think about it, because this is a complicated picture and it is remarkably understudied. The research that has been done is largely from a pre-ChatGPT era, and it's also then unclear whether preferences have changed. A simple summary of the pre-ChatGPT literature is that students tend to prefer assessments where they can see that the outcomes are fair, that there are clear right and wrong answers, and there is lower stress. Thus, not having an examiner or an invigilator watching over them, making the assessments lower stakes or no stakes, being clear about what is right or wrong, giving them the results and feedback as soon as possible. These are not absolutes, and they are very contextual, depending upon features that are outside of the assessment design principles. But you get a general sense of what makes students have a better experience. Clear, lower stress, and possibly lower stakes. All right, now on to inclusivity and equitability. We're going to do these two things together for the simple reason that they are different. Now, I know that doesn't make sense, but the distinction between them is often hard to pin down and to define. So perhaps the easiest way to do it is to give some examples and point to the aspects related to inclusivity and equitability. Very simply, inclusivity is about access to the assessment and the assessment content, and making an assessment inclusive is about removing those barriers. They don't just have to be physical barriers, though. They can just be barriers to engaging with the assessment in some way. Equitability is more about what happens once the assessment is underway, the process of the assessment. Does the assessment allow everyone to demonstrate what it is that they have learned and take account of individual differences that might make that more difficult with traditional assessment designs? Let's give you one simple example. A dyslexic student is taking a written exam. In order to make that a bit more inclusive, we might make sure that the assessment items, the exam paper, is in a readable font. We might make available assistive technology to allow the student to engage with, to understand, to read, to comprehend the assessment content. And we might give them extra time because that might take a bit of extra time to process the exam paper. Equitability, as I said, is more about the process of the assessment. Does the marking emphasize, let's say, the content and understanding rather than focusing on spelling and grammar? What you see here is a classic example of what is referred to as a reasonable adjustment. A learner has a particular set of characteristics that might make it difficult for them to be included in the original form of assessment, or for that assessment to be equitable, to be a fair reflection of what they have learned. The assessment design is then adjusted in ways that do not compromise the purpose or standards of the assessment, but are adjusted so that the learner can be a participant, can engage and access the assessment and be assessed in a fair way. This is reasonable. This can, of course, get complicated. This is just one example of a set of reasonable adjustments for one situation. Inclusivity and equitability are by nature designed to allow anyone and everyone to demonstrate what they have learned, and that includes all of our limitless individual differences and the adjustments we might put in place for them. Another way to try and achieve inclusivity and equitability is, rather than put in place adjustments to a traditional assessment design, is maybe to start again and design an assessment that is inclusive and equitable to everyone from the get-go. So in this example, rather than design a traditional assessment and then make adjustments for students with dyslexia and then other adjustments for students with other circumstances, we might just make these features available to all students. In this case, that shouldn't be too hard. Marking based on content and understanding rather than spelling and grammar should be fairly straightforward. We can take the time pressure away for all students. We can use accessible fonts for all students, etc. This is a simple example of what is called universal design for learning, or in this case, universal design of an assessment. Have one version of the assessment that everyone takes, rather than a traditional assessment and then multiple adjustments to that. Another way that you might achieve universal design is to put in a couple of options. For example, if a student has to demonstrate critical appraisal of a research article, then they might choose to do it via written methods, or they might choose to do it via oral viva methods. That's instead of maybe forcing most students to do it one way and then having the other option as a reasonable adjustment. Just have the options available for everybody. This can obviously also get complicated quite quickly once you start to put it into practice. But personally, my preference is, if you're starting from scratch, then go for universal design rather than reasonable adjustment. It just makes sense to have one assessment that's available for everyone. Now, it is very hard to properly do full justice to the topics of inclusivity and equitability in a short video. And as I'm discovering, this isn't even a short video. I can't really cover all of the things that we would need to do to make sure that you are equipped with the understanding that you need to make sure an assessment is inclusive and equitable. And I'll try and link to some more sources to help you with that in the links underneath the video. If that sounds like a cop-out, that's because partly it is. There have been some awful examples where universities have got this wrong, and it has occasionally led to tragic outcomes. These dreadful situations are thankfully rare, but they reflect maybe a more common situation where folks are put into the position of designing assessments but without having expertise in inclusivity and equitability, or without being signposted to folks who do have that expertise. My advice here is, if you're unsure, to talk to the experts. And I'll be honest with you, I am not one of those experts on this particular topic of assessment design. Most higher education providers do have some level of staff expertise in this area, and most professional bodies for your particular academic discipline will also issue guidance on inclusivity and equitability. There is also a legal component to this. Many countries have, for good reasons, legal requirements in this area. If nothing else, having the law require inclusivity and equitability has forced universities to put in place regulations and staff expertise to help folks like you and me design inclusive and equitable assessments. So talk to the experts, but please don't be put off by thinking that these are quite high stakes issues. I know many colleagues are put off by redesigning their assessments because they don't know what it is they have to do, and it feels like it might be high stakes and quite stressful, so they carry on doing what they've always been doing. I think it's reasonably safe to say that if your assessment is already inclusive and equitable, you're a long way towards knowing what to do. I've made it sound like it's quite high stakes, but there's a lot of people already doing this, and we can just talk to them. If you are using an assessment that isn't currently inclusive and equitable, then it needs to be, and there are probably legal requirements of you and your institution to make sure that it is inclusive and equitable. If you're designing a new assessment, well, then you do need to put these things in from the beginning. Okay, final assessment theory concept then is resources. Now, this is arguably not really a concept from assessment theory, but it is very, very important. And again, we go back to the title of the video, a pragmatic guide. If we were to take our ideal assessment, it would probably be very expensive, take a lot of time and other resources to try and tick off all of the components that are listed here. For many of us, this is not possible. For most of us, probably. So we need to plan and we need to prioritize. How much staff time is needed for each part of the assessment? Does staff need to be trained? How long will that take? Do we need software licenses? How many rooms do we need? How many invigilators? How long is it going to take for the pre and the post review of the items, etc., etc. Even very administrative features like printing papers, organizing parking spaces for examiners, someone has to take care of these, and we need to just make sure that they are taken care of, and we need to do that as part of an integral component of the design of an assessment, rather than designing the assessment and then dealing with the practicality afterwards. All right, now we're going to do some applied examples of all of this to look at the interactions between the different theoretical and practical components, and we can use this to revise some of the things we've already talked about and to wrap up the content of the video. We'll start with the familiar example. Let's say we want information about whether our learners have mastered the fundamental concepts, the basic knowledge of a particular subject. As we said earlier, this is commonly done in traditional old-fashioned exams, and here is one at the University of Lobster. A sports hall, individual desks, staff patrolling up and down, making sure the rules are being followed. These staff are the invigilators or the proctors. They're not the assessors. They're there for exam security and support anyone with basic procedural questions. The example I'm going to use, the exam is based upon multiple choice questions, so it gives us a broad coverage of the curriculum. We can map what this type of assessment looks like according to the concepts and practical aspects that we've just covered. So our students are answering multiple choice questions, and they're doing so under the conditions that I just described. Invigilated, closed book, meaning they don't have access to external sources. It's in real time. We're using MCQ, so there's a right and wrong answer, meaning the assessment is objective, with little room for marker judgment or subjectivity. We combine these practical features and the task of MCQs, then we end up with an assessment that is probably quite reliable, certainly compared to other assessment methods, and it's probably quite secure. It's reliable because it's objective and structured, and secure because of the invigilators and the content is unknown to the students before they sit at their exam desk. However, this assessment is probably not very authentic. There aren't many workplaces that require people's jobs to involve answering multiple choice questions. Students tend not to like these sorts of assessments, these old-fashioned, traditional, high-stakes, scrutinized exams. They're often also quite expensive. There's a lot of resources required for the estate, for the invigilators, and the security of the assessment. Let's look at a different type of assessment then, an asynchronous, traditional take-home essay or type of coursework. Students are going away and doing this type of assessment in their own time. It's uninvigilated, it's open book. Students submit it online, although they often can make notes and do things in paper. It's asynchronous, it's done in their own time. It can be high stakes, although not necessarily. We can use it for summative assessment. Essays tend to be more subjective. They can still be used for high-level assessment. Students know what they're doing when they have 2, 3, 4 weeks to do it. They generally don't get the feedback, though, until quite later on. This type of assessment is maybe more authentic than the one that we just looked at, the old-fashioned exam. There are lots of jobs that involve writing, but it's maybe not fully authentic in the way that some of the other tasks we're going to cover are. Students tend to prefer this type of assessment. It's less stress, there's less direct observation, and they can fit it around whatever other type of commitments they might have. The resources for this type of assessment are different. They're generally less resource intensive than exams, but the resource implications tend to fall on 1 or 2 individuals, people like you and me, that are going to mark maybe very many dozens of or more of essays. The reliability of this type of assessment is poor. This is one of the least reliable types of assessment that there is, and part of that is because these types of assessment are not secure at all. This has always been the case, but it's possibly now more of an issue with the rise of things like ChatGPT and other types of generative AI. Assessments like essays have never been very reliable. One marker will mark differently to another marker, and that marker will mark differently depending upon how hungry, tired, stressed, etc. that they are. Marking dozens or hundreds of essays tends to result in different levels of marking, different types of marking over the course, the long time course that it takes to do that. If we're not directly observing what it is that the students are doing, then of course they can use the internet, ChatGPT, etc. In some cases, that's okay. We might want them to access external resources to critically appraise them and to cite what it is that they have done. But in the modern age with things like ChatGPT, which can largely do academic writing very well in ways that are undetectable, this really does draw into question the security and thus the value of these types of assessments. To wrap this all up then, let's just go back to the beginning. What is an assessment for? Is to give us information about learning. If we focus on what it is that a student can do, and we define that at the beginning, then that will lead us naturally into designing an assessment that gives us appropriate information about learning for the purposes that we want to use it. We're not ever going to design a perfect assessment, as we just discussed. There are always going to be some compromises on both the theoretical and the practical aspects. But if we focus on what we want to use that information for, focusing on what the students are going to do to give us that information, then we're going to be in good shape. I hope that video was useful. If you have any questions, there's my email address, and some other videos are available on the YouTube channel. That's it. I'll see you in another video. Bye-bye.